Sarah Martinez pressed her back against the cold brick wall backstage at Lincoln Community Center. Her violin case felt heavy in her sweaty hands. Through the thin curtain, she could hear the crowd talking and laughing. Children were running around while their parents found seats. The smell of popcorn and coffee drifted from the lobby. She had been standing there for 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Her stomach twisted with nerves. This was only her third time performing in front of people. The first time was at her school's winter concert where she played with 20 other students. The second time was at her cousin's wedding where only family watched, but tonight was different. Tonight, strangers would be watching her play alone on stage. Sarah opened her violin case and looked at her instrument. It was not new or fancy. The wood was scratched in several places. One of the tuning pegs was loose and sometimes slipped during practice. Her father had bought it used from a music store 3 years ago when she first asked to learn violin. He worked 2 jobs to pay for her weekly lessons with Mrs. Chun, the music teacher at the local elementary school. Mrs. Chun appeared beside her, carrying a clipboard and looking stressed. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gray hair that was always a little messy. Tonight she wore a black dress and kept checking her watch. "Sarah, dear, are you ready?" Mrs. Chun asked softly. "You look nervous." "I am nervous," Sarah admitted. "What if I make mistakes? What if people do not like it?" Mrs. Chun smiled and put her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Remember what we practiced. Keep it simple. Play the folk song exactly like we rehearsed. Do not try anything fancy. The audience will love it because you will play it with feeling." Sarah nodded, but her hands still shook a little. Mrs. Chun had chosen a traditional Irish folk song called "Danny Boy" for her to perform. It was a slow, gentle melody that did not require difficult fingerwork or fast bow movements. Mrs. Chun said it was perfect for someone who had only been playing violin for 3 years. "Most children start when they are 5 or 6, Mrs. Chun had told her parents during their first meeting. "Sarah is starting at 14, which is late. But she has good ears for music and works hard. We will start with simple pieces and see how she progresses." Sarah remembered feeling embarrassed that day. She was too old to be a beginner. While other kids her age were playing complicated classical pieces, she was still learning how to hold the bow correctly. But her parents had been supportive. Her mother worked as a nurse at the hospital and often came home tired, but she always asked about violin practice. Her father drove trucks for a living and did not know much about music, but he listened carefully. Whenever Sarah played for the family, the sound of applause came from the main hall as another performer finished their act. Sarah peeked through a gap in the curtain. The community center's main room was packed with people. There had to be at least 200 people there. Families sat in folding chairs that were arranged in neat rows. Young children sat on blankets on the floor near the front. Teenagers stood along the walls, some looking bored and checking their phones. Near the back of the room, Sarah noticed a group of adults in nice clothes who looked different from the usual community center crowd. They sat very straight and watched each performance with serious expressions. One woman had a notepad and was writing things down. Sarah wondered who they were. "Those are professors from the music college," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Marcus, a boy from her high school who was also performing tonight. He played piano and was much more experienced than Sarah. They come to these community events sometimes to look for talented students. My piano teacher told me they offer scholarships to kids who show promise. Sarah's heart beat faster. Music college professors? Scholarships? She had never thought about studying music seriously. It seemed like something for rich kids or child prodigies, not for someone like her who started late and played a scratched-up violin. Mrs. Chun clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. "Performers, we have 15 minutes until the second half begins. Sarah, you are the third act after intermission. Make sure your violin is tuned." Sarah carefully took her violin out of its case. The instrument felt familiar in her hands now, even though it had taken months to get comfortable holding it. She remembered her first lesson when the violin had felt awkward and foreign. Her chin did not know where to rest. Her left hand cramped from pressing the strings. The bow had seemed to have a mind of its own, creating scratchy sounds instead of music, but Mrs. Chun had been patient. Week after week, she taught Sarah proper posture, finger placement, and bow technique. Slowly, the scratchy sounds became notes. The notes became simple melodies. Sarah discovered she loved the feeling of the vibrations against her chin and chest. When she played, music seemed to flow through her body in a way that felt natural and right. During the past year, Sarah had started practicing more than Mrs. Chun assigned. After finishing her homework each night, she would take out her violin and play the songs they were working on. Then she would play songs she found online or pieces she heard on the radio. She tried to figure them out by ear, experimenting with different fingerings and bow patterns. Her parents probably thought she was just practicing her lesson songs, but Sarah had secret musical adventures during those evening sessions. She played along with recordings of famous violinists. She tried to copy the emotional way they played, even though her technique was not advanced enough to match their skill. Sometimes she would play the same phrase over and over, trying to make it sound more beautiful or more sad or more exciting. The intermission bell rang, which meant Sarah had just a few more minutes before her turn. Her mouth felt dry. She wished she had brought a water bottle. Mrs. Chun always told her students to stay hydrated before performing, but Sarah had been too nervous to remember. Sarah Martinez called the stage manager, a volunteer from the community center who was keeping track of the schedule. "You are up in 2 acts. Please be ready to go on stage." Sarah tuned her violin one more time, even though it did not really need it. The simple melody of Danny Boy played in her head. She had practiced it so many times that she could play it perfectly without thinking. Mrs. Chun had chosen it specifically because it was well within Sarah's abilities. There was no risk of embarrassing mistakes or memory lapses, but as Sarah stood there waiting, something strange happened. Other melodies started mixing with Danny Boy in her mind. Variations and decorations that she had never tried before began to suggest themselves. Her fingers wanted to try different positions on the strings. Her bow arm felt like it wanted to create different sounds and textures. Sarah shook her head and forced herself to focus on the simple version she was supposed to play. Mrs. Chun had been clear about this. Keep it basic. Do not try to show off. Play it safe and play it well. The second act finished their performance and left the stage to applause. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. In just a few minutes, she would walk out onto that stage in front of all those people, including the music professors who might be judging her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In her mind, she played through Danny Boy one more time, note by note, exactly as Mrs. Chun had taught her. The second act was just finishing their dance routine when Mrs. Chun came rushing backstage with a worried look on her face. She was holding her phone and speaking quickly to someone on the other end. Sarah could only catch parts of the conversation. "Yes, I understand, food poisoning, minutes ago. No, she cannot perform tonight." Mrs. Chun hung up and looked around at the remaining performers. Her face was pale and she kept pushing her messy gray hair behind her ears, which she always did when she was stressed. "We have a problem," Mrs. Chun announced to the group of students waiting backstage. "Jennifer Walsh was supposed to be our featured performer tonight. She plays classical piano and was going to perform right before the finale. But she just called from the hospital. She ate something bad at dinner and is too sick to come." Sarah knew Jennifer Walsh by reputation. She was 19 years old and had been playing piano since she was 4. Jennifer had won several regional competitions and was studying at the music college downtown. Her performance was always the highlight of these community center shows. People came specifically to hear her play. Marcus, the piano player from Sarah's school, raised his hand. "I could play something extra if you need me to." Mrs. Chun shook her head. "Thank you, Marcus, but you are already performing twice tonight." "The problem is timing." Jennifer was scheduled for a 20-minute slot. "If we just skip her act, the show will end too early and people will feel cheated." They paid money for tickets expecting a full evening of music. Sarah listened while Mrs. Chun explained the situation to the stage manager. The community center used these talent shows to raise money for their youth programs. People had bought tickets expecting 2 hours of entertainment. Without Jennifer's long piano performance, the show would be 30 minutes shorter than advertised. "Can we ask people to repeat their acts?" suggested the stage manager. "Some of the younger children are already tired," Mrs. Chun replied. "And the audience will notice if we just fill time with repeated songs. We need something substantial." Sarah felt sorry for Mrs. Chun. She had been organizing these shows for 15 years and took pride in giving the audience a good experience. Mrs. Chun always said that community performances were important because they brought people together and gave young musicians a chance to share their gifts. The current act on stage finished and came. Backstage, Mrs. Chun checked her clipboard and called out, "Sarah Martinez, you are next." Then we have the youth choir, followed by Marcus with his jazz piece. Sarah picked up her violin case and started walking toward the stage entrance, but Mrs. Chun caught her arm gently. "Sarah, wait. I have an idea, but I need to ask you something." First, Mrs. Chun looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "How comfortable do you feel with your violin playing?" "I mean, beyond just the song we practiced, what do you mean?" Sarah asked, though her heart was already beating faster. "Well, during your lessons, I have noticed that you sometimes play around with the melodies. You add little decorations and changes that we did not practice. You have good musical instincts." Mrs. Chun paused and glanced toward the stage. "What if instead of just playing Danny Boy once, you played a longer set? Maybe the main song? Plus one or two others?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "I do not know any other complete songs well enough to perform them." "But you know parts of many songs, right? I've heard you humming different melodies during lessons, and you have good ears. You could probably play simple versions of songs you know by heart. Double quotes. Mrs. Chun was right. Sarah did know bits and pieces of many songs. She often played along with music on the radio or tried to figure out movie theme songs by ear. But she had never performed any of those experiments for other people. "I do not think I'm good enough for that," Sarah said quietly. "What if I make mistakes? What if people expect too much?" Mrs. Chun squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "Listen to me. I have been teaching music for 25 years. I can tell when someone has natural talent, even if they started late. You have something special, Sarah. Maybe tonight is the time to let people see it." The applause from the main hall told them that the current act had finished. Sarah was supposed to walk on stage in less than 2 minutes. Her palms were sweating and her violin case felt even heavier than before. "But the music professors are out there," Sarah whispered. "What if they think I am not ready? What if I embarrass myself? Or what if they see something wonderful?" Mrs. Chun replied. "Sarah, those professors come to these shows because they know that sometimes they discover amazing talent in unexpected places. Jennifer Walsh was discovered at a community show just like this one when she was 16. Sarah looked through the gap in the curtain again. The audience was settling back into their seats after applauding the previous act. She could see her parents in the 4th row. Her father had left work early to be there. Her mother had switched shifts at the hospital. They were both smiling and looking excited to see her perform. Near the back, the group of well-dressed adults were still watching attentively. The woman with the notepad had her pen ready. Sarah wondered what she wrote about each performer. Did she take notes about technique, about stage presence, about potential? "I would not ask you to do this if I did not believe you could handle it," Mrs. Chun continued. "But I think this might be an opportunity for you. Not just to help our show, but to challenge yourself. To see what you are really capable of." The stage manager appeared beside them. "Sarah Martinez, you are on in 30 seconds. Sarah's mind was racing. She could stick with the original plan and play Danny Boy exactly as rehearsed. It would be safe and comfortable. She would not risk making mistakes or looking foolish. But the performance would be over in 4 minutes, and then she would sit backstage for the rest of the show, knowing she had missed a chance to do something more, or she could take Mrs. Chun's suggestion and try to fill Jennifer's longer time slot. It would be risky and scary, She might forget how songs went or play wrong notes. But she might also discover something about herself that she did not know was there. What songs would I play? Sarah asked quickly. Start with Danny Boy Since. You know it perfectly. Then maybe some other folk songs or simple classical pieces. You could even try some popular songs if you know them well enough. Just follow your instincts and play what feels right. Sarah thought about all those evenings alone in her room, experimenting with different melodies and trying to make her violin sing in new ways. She thought about how music made her feel when no one was listening, and she could play freely without worrying about making mistakes. 15 seconds, Sarah, called the stage manager. Sarah looked at Mrs. Chun one more time. Her teacher's face was encouraging but also nervous. This was a risk for both of them. If Sarah played beautifully, it would reflect well on Mrs. Chun's teaching. If Sarah struggled, people might wonder why Mrs. Chun had suggested something beyond her students' abilities. Okay, Sarah said quietly. I will try. Mrs. Chun smiled and gave her a quick hug. Trust yourself, Sarah. Let the music guide you. The stage manager gestured toward the entrance. Sarah walked to the edge of the curtain and waited for her introduction. She could hear the announcer speaking to the audience. Our next performer is Sarah Martinez, a 17-year-old student who has been playing violin for 3 years. Tonight she will be performing an extended set of folk and classical pieces. Sarah's eyes widened. An extended set. It was official now. There was no going back to the simple 4-minute performance she had originally planned. She was about to walk onto that stage and attempt something she had never done before, in front of 200 people, including music professors who might change her life forever. Sarah stepped through the curtain and onto the stage. The bright lights hit her face immediately, making her blink. For a moment, she could not see the audience at all. The stage felt much bigger than it had during rehearsal that afternoon when the room was empty. She walked to the center of the stage where a single microphone stand waited. There was no chair, which meant she would be standing for her entire performance. Sarah had practiced sitting down, but Mrs. Chun had told her that standing would look more professional for a longer set. As her eyes adjusted to the lights, the faces in the audience became clearer. The room was completely full. Every seat was taken and people were standing along the walls. Sarah had never performed for this many people before. At school concerts, half the audience was usually other students who were not really paying attention. But these people had paid money to be here. They expected to be entertained. She opened her violin case on the small table that had been placed beside the microphone. Her hands were shaking slightly as she lifted out her instrument. The violin felt different under the stage lights. The scratches on the wood seemed more obvious. One of the strings looked a little loose. Sarah quickly tuned her violin, trying to ignore the fact that 200 people were watching her do it. She could hear small conversations starting in the audience. People were probably wondering who she was and why she was taking Jennifer Walsh's place. Jennifer was well known in the community. Sarah was just a high school student most people had never heard of. Near the front, she spotted her parents. Her father was holding up his phone, probably ready to record her performance. Her mother was smiling encouragingly, but Sarah could see worry in her eyes too. They knew this was supposed to be a simple 4-minute song. The announcement about an extended set had probably surprised them as much as it surprised Sarah. Mrs. Chun stood in the wings where Sarah could see her. She gave Sarah a thumbs up and mouthed the words, "You can do this." But Sarah noticed that Mrs. Chun looked nervous too. Her teacher was probably having second thoughts about suggesting this change. The music professors at the back of the room were watching with polite but neutral expressions. The woman with the notepad had her pen ready. Sarah wondered what she would write. Would she compare Sarah to Jennifer Walsh? Would she note that Sarah was just a replacement performer who was not supposed to be there? Sarah raised her violin to her chin and positioned her bow. The room became quieter as people realized she was about to start, but the quiet was not complete. She could still hear babies making small noises and children whispering to their parents. Someone coughed near the back. A phone buzzed somewhere. In the middle rows, this was so different from practicing alone in her bedroom. At home, the only sounds were her violin and maybe some traffic outside her window. Here, she was surrounded by the small noises that 200 people make just by existing in the same space. Sarah tried to block out the distractions and focus on the music in her head. She decided to start with Danny Boy, as planned. It was the song she knew best, and playing something familiar would help her feel more confident. Sarah took a deep breath and placed her bow on the strings. The first note came out clean and clear. The room became a little quieter. Sarah played the opening phrase of the melody, the same notes she had practiced hundreds of times. Her fingers found their positions automatically. Her bow moved smoothly across the strings, but something felt different. In her bedroom, Danny Boy sounded gentle and personal. Here on stage, with all these people listening, it sounded small. The melody seemed to get lost in the big room. Sarah could tell that people in the back rows were having trouble hearing her clearly. She finished the first verse and paused briefly. This was the point where she would normally end the song and take a bow, but tonight she was supposed to keep playing. The problem was that she had not really planned what to do next. Mrs. Chun had suggested following her instincts, but her instincts were telling her to run off stage and hide. Sarah looked out at the audience. Some people were smiling politely. Others were checking their phones or looking around the room. A few children near the front were starting to fidget. She could sense that she was losing their attention. Near the middle of the room, she noticed an elderly man who was leaning forward and listening intently. He had his eyes closed and seemed to be really enjoying the music. Seeing his face reminded Sarah why she loved playing violin in the first place. It was not about impressing people or avoiding mistakes. It was about sharing something beautiful. Sarah decided to play the second verse of Danny Boy, but with some small changes. During her practice sessions at home, she had experimented with adding little decorations to the melody. Nothing too complicated, just simple variations that made the song more interesting. She had never tried them in front of other people, but maybe this was the time. She began the second verse with the basic melody, but this time she added a few extra notes between the main phrases. She used vibrato to make some of the longer notes sound more expressive. She changed the rhythm slightly in a few places to create more emotion. The audience seemed to notice the difference. People stopped looking at their phones. The conversations grew quieter. Even some of the children became more attentive. Sarah realized that she was beginning to connect with the listeners in a way that the simple, basic version had not achieved. But she also noticed that the music professors were paying closer attention now. The woman with the notepad was writing something down. Sarah felt a flutter of panic. Were they impressed by her improvements, or were they noting that she was changing the arrangement without permission? Sarah finished Danny Boy and paused again. The audience applauded, but it was polite applause, not enthusiastic. She still had at least 15 more minutes to fill. Jennifer Walsh would have played complex classical pieces that showed off advanced technique. Sarah did not have that level of skill, but she needed to find a way to keep the audience interested. She thought about the songs she knew partially. There was an Irish folk tune called Whiskey in the Jar that she had learned by ear from a recording. She also knew parts of some classical pieces, including a simple Bach minuet and the main theme from Pachelbel's canon. None of these were perfectly memorized, but she could probably work her way through them if she stayed calm. Sarah decided to try Whiskey in the Jar next. It was more upbeat than Danny Boy and might wake up the audience a little. She had never performed it before, but she had played it many times at home just for fun. She started the lively melody and immediately felt more confident. This song had a stronger rhythm and a clearer character. It was the kind of tune that people might tap their feet to. As she played, Sarah noticed that some audience members were indeed moving slightly to the beat, but halfway through the song, she hit a section that she had never practiced thoroughly. She knew the general shape of the melody, but not the exact notes. For a moment, Sarah felt lost. She could either stop and apologize, or she could try to improvise her way through the tricky part. Sarah chose to keep playing. She used her ear to guide her, playing notes that sounded like they belonged even if they were not exactly what the original composer had written. It was risky, but it felt more honest than stopping and admitting defeat. The music professors were definitely paying attention now. Sarah could not tell if their expressions were impressed or concerned. Playing from memory was one thing, but making up parts of songs as you went along was something else entirely. Sarah wondered if they thought she was being creative or just unprepared. Sarah finished Whiskey in the Jar and felt a small rush of relief. She had made it through the improvised section without any obvious mistakes. The audience clapped a little more enthusiastically this time. A few people even smiled and nodded their approval. But Sarah knew she still had more than 10 minutes left to fill. She looked at Mrs. Chun in the wings. Her teacher was smiling, but Sarah could see tension in her shoulders. Mrs. Chun probably had not expected Sarah to start changing songs and making up parts. This was going beyond what they had discussed backstage. Sarah wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. The stage lights were hot and she was starting to sweat. Her left hand felt a little cramped from the unfamiliar finger positions she had been using. She needed to choose her next song carefully. As she stood there thinking, Sarah became very aware of the silence in the room. 200 people were waiting for her to continue. She could hear someone's stomach growling 3 rows back. A baby was making soft cooing sounds. Outside, a car honked its horn. The pressure was building. Sarah realized that this was the moment where everything would either come together or fall apart. She could play it safe and stick to simple songs she knew well, or she could try something. That had been growing in her mind ever since she walked onto the stage. For the past few minutes, while playing the folk songs, Sarah had been hearing other melodies in her head. They were not specific songs, but musical ideas that seemed to flow naturally from what she was already playing. Her fingers wanted to explore different parts of the violin. Her bow wanted to try different sounds and textures during her practice. Sessions at home, Sarah often played what she called musical conversations. She would start with one melody and then let it lead to another idea and then another. Sometimes she ended up in completely different musical territory from where she started. It was like following a path through the woods without knowing where it would lead, but doing that kind of musical exploration on stage in front of strangers was a completely different thing. There were no rules or safety nets. If she got lost in the music, there was no way to go back and try again. Sarah looked out at the audience again. In the third row, she noticed a little girl who could not have been more than 6 years old. The child was sitting on the edge of her seat, watching Sarah with complete attention. Her eyes were bright and interested. She seemed to be waiting to see what magical thing might happen next. That little girl's face reminded Sarah of how she herself felt when she first heard violin music. It was at a street festival 2 years before she started taking lessons. A man was playing violin on the corner, and Sarah had stopped to listen. The music had made her feel something she could not put into words. It was like hearing someone speak a language she did not know, but somehow understood perfectly. Sarah realized that the little girl in the audience was having that same experience right now. The child was not thinking about whether the notes were correct or whether Sarah was following the rules. She was just listening to music and feeling whatever it made her feel. Near the back of the room, the music professors were still watching. The woman with the notepad had stopped writing and was just listening. One of the men was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. Another woman was tapping her fingers silently against her leg. Sarah made a decision. She was going to stop trying to play specific songs and instead follow the music wherever it wanted to go. It was risky and probably not what Mrs. Chun expected, but it felt like the honest thing to do. She raised her violin again and started with a simple melody that had just come into her head. It was not any song she had ever heard before. It was just a musical idea that seemed to grow naturally from the folk tunes she had been playing. The melody started in a low register and climbed slowly upward. Sarah used long, smooth bow strokes to make the notes flow into each other. She added vibrato to some notes to give them more warmth and expression. As she played, she felt herself relaxing for the first time since walking onto the stage. the audience seemed to sense the change immediately. The room became quieter. People stopped shifting in their seats. Even the restless children became still. Sarah was no longer just playing songs for them. She was sharing something more personal and direct. As the melody developed, Sarah began to hear harmony lines in her mind. She started playing double stops, which meant playing two notes at the same time. It was a technique Mrs. Chun had shown her only a few times, but Sarah's fingers seemed to remember how to do it. The harmony notes made the music sound fuller and richer. Sarah was entering musical territory she had never explored before, at least not in front of other people. She was making up music as she went along, using her violin to express feelings and ideas that she did not have words for. It was scary and exciting at the same time. She could feel the audience responding to her new approach. People were leaning forward. The conversations had stopped completely. Even the babies seemed quieter. Sarah realized that she had found a way to connect with the listeners that went beyond just playing the right notes. But with this connection came a new kind of responsibility. Sarah was no longer just a student performing her assignment. She was a musician sharing her own voice. The audience was trusting her to take them on a musical journey, and they were following wherever she led. Sarah let the melody evolve and change. Sometimes it became sad and longing. Sometimes it became playful and dancing. She used different bow techniques to create different textures. She played some notes with sharp, crisp attacks and others with soft, gentle beginnings. She experimented with the spaces between notes, letting silence become part of the music. As she played, Sarah noticed that her nervousness was disappearing. She was no longer worried about making mistakes or impressing the professors. She was completely focused on the music and the feeling of sharing it with other people. This was what she had been searching for during all those evening practice sessions in her bedroom. The music professors were definitely paying attention now. All four of them were sitting forward and watching Sarah carefully. The woman with the notepad had picked up her pen again, but she was not writing. She was just holding it and listening. Sarah's parents looked amazed. They had never seen their daughter perform like this before. At home, they usually heard her practicing scales or working on assignments. This was the first time they were seeing the creative side of Sarah's musical personality. Mrs. Chun looked both proud and nervous. This was far beyond anything she had taught Sarah to do. Her student was displaying musical instincts and creativity that went beyond her formal training. It was exciting, but also a little frightening for a teacher to watch. Sarah felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. She could continue with this musical exploration and see where it led, or she could step back to safer ground. The next few minutes would determine whether this performance became something ordinary or something that people would remember for a long time. She took a deep breath and made her choice. She was going to jump off the cliff and trust that the music would catch her. Sarah closed her eyes and let the music flow through her. The simple melody she had started with began to change and grow. It was like watching a flower bloom in fast motion. Each phrase led naturally to the next, and each new idea felt more confident than the last. She started adding ornaments to the basic melody. These were small decorative notes that danced around the main tune. Sarah had heard ornaments in recordings of Irish traditional music, but she had never tried to play them herself. Now, standing on stage with her eyes closed, her fingers seemed to know exactly what to do. The audience was completely quiet now. Even the restless children had stopped moving. Sarah could feel their attention like a warm presence surrounding her. It was different from the polite but distant feeling she had sensed when she first walked onto the stage. Now the listeners were truly with her, following every note. Sarah opened her eyes and saw faces that looked different than they had 10 minutes earlier. People were not just watching her perform anymore. They were experiencing something together. With her, the elderly man who had been listening with his eyes closed now had a small smile on his face. The little girl in the third row was swaying slightly to the rhythm. Even more surprising, Sarah noticed that some of the teenagers who had been looking bored were now paying complete attention. One boy, who had been checking his phone constantly, was now staring at Sarah with his mouth slightly open. A group of girls near the wall had moved closer to get a better view. The transformation was not just happening in the audience. Sarah felt like she was becoming a different person on stage. The nervous high school student who had walked through the curtain was disappearing. In her place was someone who understood music in a deeper way and was not afraid to share that. Understanding. Sarah began experimenting with dynamics, which meant playing some parts loudly and others softly. She would play a phrase very quietly, so quietly that people had to lean forward to hear it. Then she would repeat the same phrase with full volume, making the contrast dramatic and exciting. The audience responded to each change, sitting forward. During the quiet parts and relaxing during the louder sections, she started using the entire range of her violin. During lessons, Mrs. Chun usually kept Sarah in the comfortable middle positions to avoid mistakes. But now, Sarah was exploring the highest notes, which sounded bright and singing, and the lowest notes, which were rich and mysterious. Each register of the violin had its own personality, and Sarah was introducing the audience to all of them. The music professors were completely focused now. Sarah could see them exchanging glances with each other. The woman with the notepad was writing rapidly, but she kept looking up so she would not miss anything. One of the men was nodding his head slightly, as if he was agreeing with something the music was saying. Sarah realized that she was no longer playing individual songs. Instead, she was creating one long, flowing piece of music that included elements from different traditions. She heard echoes of the Irish folk tunes she had started with, but also classical phrases, jazz rhythms, and even some popular music influences that came from her generation. This mixing of styles was something Sarah had done naturally during her practice sessions at home, but she had never thought of it as something worthy of sharing with others. She assumed that real musicians stayed within one style at a time, but here on stage the combination felt natural and honest. It was simply the way Sarah heard music in her mind. She began using techniques that Mrs. Chun had shown her but told her not to try until she was more advanced. Sarah played pizzicato, which meant plucking the strings with her fingers instead of using the bow. The plucked notes created a different texture that added variety to the sound. She also tried harmonics, which were special fingering techniques that created bell-like tones. Some of these advanced techniques did not work perfectly. Sarah's harmonics were not as clear as a professional's would be, and her pizzicato was not as crisp as it could have been. But the slight imperfections actually made the music more human and personal. The audience could tell that Sarah was pushing herself to try new things right in front of them. Mrs. Chun was watching with her hand over her mouth. Sarah could not tell if her teacher was amazed or worried. This performance was going far beyond anything they had ever discussed in lessons. Sarah was displaying musical abilities that she had apparently been developing on her own, without guidance or permission. The melody continued to evolve, and Sarah found herself playing with more emotion than she ever had before. When the music called for sadness, she made the violin cry with long, singing notes. When it called for joy, she made it dance with quick, light passages. When it called for mystery, she used unusual bow techniques to create sounds that were almost like whispers. Sarah was discovering that her violin could be like a voice that expressed feelings more directly than words ever could. She had always known this intellectually, but experiencing it in front of an audience was completely different. She felt like she was having a conversation with 200 people without saying a single word. The audience was responding to every emotional change in the music. When Sarah played something sad, she could see people's faces become more thoughtful. When she played something playful, she could see small smiles appearing. When she played something dramatic, she could feel the tension in the room increase. Near the middle of the room, Sarah noticed a woman who had tears in her eyes. The woman was not crying from sadness, but from the kind of deep feeling that beautiful music can create. Seeing this reaction made Sarah realize that she was giving the audience something meaningful, not just entertainment. The music professors were no longer just watching and evaluating. They were listening as music lovers, not just as teachers. Sarah could see that they were being affected by the performance in the same way as everyone else in the room. This was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. Sarah had always thought of professors and professional musicians as people who were beyond being impressed by Amateur performances? She assumed they heard so much good music that a high school student could never create anything that would truly move them. But the expressions on their faces suggested otherwise. As the music continued to develop, Sarah felt herself entering a state she had never experienced before. It was like being completely awake and completely relaxed at the same time. She was aware of every person in the audience, but she was also lost in the music. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. Her technique was improving even as she played. Passages that would have been difficult for her an hour earlier were now flowing easily from her fingers. It was as if the performance itself was teaching her how to play better. The combination of adrenaline, focus, and pure musical instinct was pushing her abilities beyond their normal limits. Sarah realized that she was no longer nervous about making mistakes. Mistakes had become impossible because there was no wrong way to play what she was creating. Every note she chose became the right note simply because she chose it. This freedom was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. The audience seemed to sense that they were witnessing something special. People were not just listening anymore. They were present in a way that rarely happens during live performances. The normal barriers between performer and audience were dissolving. Sarah and the listeners were sharing the same musical experience. Together, Sarah knew that she was approaching the climax of her performance. She could feel the music building towards something important, something that would bring all the different elements together in a way that would satisfy both her and the audience. Sarah felt the music reaching towards something powerful. All the melodies and experiments from the past 15 minutes were coming together like pieces of a puzzle. She could sense that the audience was waiting with her, holding their breath. For whatever was about to happen, she began weaving together themes from all the different songs she had played. The gentle opening of Danny Boy returned, but now it was richer and more complex. She layered it with the lively rhythm from Whiskey in the Jar, and added harmonies that she had discovered during her improvisation. The combination created something entirely new. Sarah's bow work became more sophisticated than it had ever been before. She used long, flowing strokes for the melodic lines and short, precise movements for the rhythmic sections. She changed the pressure and speed constantly, creating a wide range of colors and textures. Her left hand moved up and down the fingerboard with confidence she did not know she possessed. The audience was completely captivated. Sarah could see people swaying slightly to the music. Some had their eyes closed, letting the sound wash over them. Others watched her fingers with fascination, trying to understand how she was creating such complex music. The room felt charged with energy and attention. Mrs. Chun was staring at Sarah with amazement. During 3 years of lessons, she had never seen her student play with this level of skill and creativity. Sarah was using techniques that Mrs. Chun had not taught her, and expressing musical ideas that went far beyond her formal training. It was like watching a butterfly emerge from a cocoon. The music professors were no longer taking notes or evaluating. They were simply listening with the pure enjoyment of people who loved music. Sarah could see that she had surprised them. They had come expecting to hear student performances, but Sarah was giving them something that transcended that category. Sarah began building toward the climax of her performance. She started with a simple melody in the lower register of her violin, and then repeated it higher and higher, each time adding more ornaments and complexity. The effect was like climbing a musical mountain, with each repetition bringing more intensity and excitement. As she climbed higher on the violin, the notes became more brilliant and penetrating. Sarah's vibrato became wider and more expressive. She was no longer just playing notes. She was making the violin sing with human emotion. The instrument seemed to have become part of her voice, expressing feelings that were too deep for words. The little girl in the third row was sitting on the edge of her seat with her hands clasped together. Her face showed the kind of wonder that children feel when they witness something magical. Several adults around her had similar expressions. Sarah realized that she was giving the audience an experience they would remember for years. Sarah incorporated jazz elements that she had picked up from listening to recordings. She played some phrases with a swing rhythm that made them feel loose and spontaneous. She added blue notes, which were slightly bent pitches that created a soulful, emotional effect. These influences mixed naturally with the folk and classical elements. Her technique was now operating at a level that should have taken years more study to achieve. The performance itself seemed to be teaching her new abilities. Her intonation was perfect, meaning every note was exactly in tune. Her rhythm was steady but flexible, creating forward momentum without feeling rushed. Her phrasing was mature and sophisticated. Sarah began using the full dynamic range of her instrument. She played some passages so softly that they were barely audible, creating intimate moments that drew the audience closer. Then she would burst into loud, passionate sections that filled the entire room with sound. The contrast made every moment more dramatic and meaningful. She started incorporating contemporary classical techniques that she had heard in modern recordings. She used extended bow techniques to create unusual sounds and textures. She played col legno, which meant hitting the strings with the wooden part of the bow instead of the hair, creating a percussive effect. She experimented with sul ponticello, playing very close to the bridge to create an intense, glassy sound. The audience had never heard these sounds from a violin before. Some people looked surprised and intrigued. Others leaned forward to understand where these new timbres were coming from. Sarah was expanding their understanding of what the violin could do. Just as she was expanding her own understanding, near the back of the room, she noticed that more people had gathered. Word was apparently spreading through the community center that something special was happening in the main hall. Staff members and volunteers who were working in other parts of the building had come to listen. They stood quietly along the walls. Not wanting to disturb the performance, Sarah's parents looked like they were seeing their daughter for the first time. They had always known she loved music and worked hard at her lessons, but they had no idea she was capable of this level of artistry. Her father had stopped recording with his phone and was just watching with his mouth slightly open. Her mother had tears running down her cheeks. The music began incorporating elements that seemed to come from Sarah's own generation. She played phrases that had the energy of rock music but the sophistication of classical composition. She used rhythms that young people would recognize but presented them with the elegance of traditional violin technique. She was creating a bridge between different musical worlds. Sarah realized that she was no longer performing someone else's music. She was creating her own musical statement, using the violin to express her unique perspective and personality. This was what it meant to be a real musician, not just someone who played other people's compositions accurately. The professors were watching with expressions that Sarah had never seen on adult faces before when they looked at her. It was a mixture of respect, surprise, and genuine artistic appreciation. They were no longer seeing her as a student who might have potential. They were seeing her as a young artist who was already creating something meaningful. Sarah felt the music building toward its final climax. She had been playing for almost 25 minutes, much longer than anyone had expected. But the audience showed no signs of restlessness or boredom. If anything, they seemed more engaged with each passing minute. Sarah had taken them on a journey, and they trusted her to bring them to a satisfying destination. She began gathering all the musical threads she had been developing throughout the performance. The folk melodies, the classical techniques, the jazz influences, the contemporary sounds, and her own original ideas all started weaving together into a final statement. It was like watching a master weaver create a tapestry from many different colored threads. Sarah's playing reached an intensity and sophistication that surprised even her. She was using every technique she had ever learned and some that she was discovering in the moment. Her violin sang, cried, danced, and soared. The music expressed the full range of human emotion and experience. The audience was completely silent except for the music. Even the babies had stopped making noise. Sarah had created a moment of perfect focus and attention. 200 people were sharing a single musical experience. United by the power of live performance. Sarah could feel that the climax was coming. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady. She was about to bring this extraordinary performance to its conclusion, and she wanted to give the audience something they would never forget. Sarah drew her bow across the strings for the final time. The last note hung in the air like a perfect crystal, pure and clear. She held the bow against the strings for an extra moment, letting the vibration fade naturally into silence. Then, she slowly lowered her violin and stood completely still. The silence that followed was different from any silence Sarah had ever experienced. It was not empty or awkward. It was full of electricity and emotion. 200 people sat without moving, as if they were afraid that any sound might break the magic of what they had just witnessed. Sarah looked out at the audience and saw faces that seemed transformed. People were staring at her with expressions of amazement and disbelief. Some had their mouths open. Others had tears in their eyes. The little girl in the third row was clutching her mother's arm and whispering something urgently in her ear. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. Sarah began to worry that something was wrong. Had she played too long? Had she made terrible mistakes that she had not noticed? Had she embarrassed herself and disappointed everyone? Then someone started clapping. It was the elderly man who had been listening with his eyes closed. He began applauding slowly and deliberately, as if each clap was important. Within seconds, other people joined him. The applause grew like a wave, building strength as it approaches the shore, but this was not ordinary applause. People were not just clapping politely because the performance was over. They were clapping with enthusiasm and genuine emotion. Sarah could hear the difference in the quality of the sound. This was appreciation, not mere politeness. More and more people began standing up. The woman with tears in her eyes rose to her feet while still clapping. The teenagers along the wall straightened up and joined the applause. Parents lifted their small children so they could see Sarah better while they clapped. Within 30 seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. Sarah had never seen anything like it. At school concerts, people usually clapped for a reasonable amount of time and then sat down. But this applause kept growing stronger instead of fading away. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the response. She had never imagined that her playing could affect people so deeply. She stood on stage holding her violin and bow, not sure what to do with her hands or where to look. The bright lights seemed even brighter now, and the sound of applause was almost overwhelming. Her parents were clapping so hard that Sarah worried they might hurt their hands. Her father was wiping his eyes with his free hand while continuing to applaud. Her mother was shaking her head in amazement while clapping enthusiastically. They looked proud and surprised and emotional all at the same time. Mrs. Chun was applauding from the wings with tears streaming down her face. She was smiling bigger than Sarah had ever seen her smile. Mrs. Chun had been teaching music for 25 years, but she looked like she had just witnessed something completely new and wonderful. The music professors were not just standing and clapping. They were exchanging excited words with each other while they applauded. The woman with the notepad was trying to clap and write at the same time. One of the men was shaking his head in disbelief. Another was pointing at Sarah and saying something to his colleagues. Sarah noticed that the applause was not stopping. If anything, it was getting louder and more enthusiastic. People were starting to call out things like, "Bravo!" and "Amazing!" Some were whistling and cheering. The sound filled the entire room and seemed to vibrate through the walls. Children, who had been restless earlier, were now clapping excitedly and jumping up and down. The little girl in the third row was pulling on her mother's dress and pointing at Sarah with obvious excitement. Even babies who could not understand what was happening seemed affected by the energy in the room. Sarah realized that people were not just appreciating her performance. They were celebrating what they had experienced together. The applause was as much about their own emotional journey as it was about her playing. She had taken them somewhere special, and they were grateful for the trip. The community center staff members, who had gathered along the walls, were applauding with just as much enthusiasm as the paying audience. The stage manager was clapping and grinning. The volunteers who ran the concession stand were applauding. Even the janitor had appeared in the back of the room and was joining the ovation. Sarah tried to take a bow, but the applause was so loud and energetic that people might not have noticed. She felt like she should say something, but she had no idea what words could match the moment. Instead, she just smiled and nodded her thanks to different sections of the audience. The applause continued for what Sarah later learned was nearly 3 minutes. In performance terms, that was an extremely long ovation. Most high school performances received polite applause that lasted 15 or 20 seconds. Even professional concerts rarely generated sustained applause of this length. When the clapping finally began to fade, people did not sit down immediately. They remained standing as if they were reluctant to let the moment end. There was an energy in the room that nobody wanted to lose. Sarah could see people talking excitedly to each other and gesturing toward the stage. Finally, the audience began to settle back into their seats, but the atmosphere remained electric. People were still smiling and shaking their heads in amazement. Sarah could hear fragments of conversations. I had no idea she could play like that, and where did that come from? And that was incredible. The music professors were having an animated discussion among themselves. They kept looking at Sarah and then back at each other. The woman with the notepad was writing rapidly, trying to capture her thoughts while they were fresh. Sarah wondered what they were saying and whether it was positive or negative. Sarah's parents looked like they needed to sit down. The emotional impact of watching their daughter's transformation had clearly affected them deeply. Her father was still shaking his head in disbelief. Her mother was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while smiling broadly. Mrs. Chun walked onto the stage and put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. She leaned close and whispered, "That was extraordinary, Sarah. I am so proud of you." Her voice was shaky with emotion. Sarah realized that she was trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was beginning to fade, and she was becoming aware of how much energy she had expended. Her left hand was cramped from the intense fingerwork. Her right shoulder ached from the bow movements. But she also felt more alive and awake than she ever had before. The stage manager approached with a wireless microphone. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think the audience would love to hear you say a few words." Sarah took the microphone with shaking hands. She had never spoken to an audience this large before. But after what she had just accomplished with her violin, talking seemed like a much smaller challenge. She looked out at the sea of expectant faces and realized that these people were no longer strangers. Through the music, she had connected with each of them in a personal way. They had shared something meaningful together, and that had created a bond between performer and audience that would last beyond this evening. Sarah held the microphone close to her mouth and looked out at the audience. Her heart was still beating fast from the performance, but she felt calmer now. The faces looking back at her were friendly and encouraging. These people had just shared something special with her, and she wanted to thank them properly. "I do not really know what to say," Sarah began, her voice slightly shaky. "When I walked onto this stage tonight, I was planning to play one simple song for 4 minutes. I never expected anything like this to happen." The audience laughed gently, and some people nodded. They could see that Sarah was being completely honest with them. "I want to thank Mrs. Chain for believing in me and giving me the chance to try something new tonight. And I want to thank all of you for listening so carefully and going on this musical journey with me. You made me feel brave enough to play music I did not even know I had inside me." The audience applauded warmly. Sarah handed the microphone back to the stage manager and walked toward the wings where Mrs. Chun was waiting. But before she could leave the stage, she noticed that several people were standing up and moving toward the front of the room. The music professors were walking purposefully down the aisle. The woman with the notepad reached the stage first. She was smiling broadly and looked excited. "Sarah," she called out, "could we speak with you for a moment? I am Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the Conservatory of Music downtown." That was an absolutely remarkable performance. Sarah felt her stomach flutter with nervousness again. She had been so focused on the performance itself that she had almost forgotten about the professors who had been watching and evaluating her. Now they wanted to talk to her, and she had no idea what they might say. Mrs. Chun guided Sarah down the stage steps to meet the professors. Sarah's parents appeared beside them, looking proud but also protective. Her father put his hand on her shoulder while her mother stood close by her side. Dr. Morrison was joined by 3 other professors. They all looked excited and impressed. One was a tall man with gray hair who introduced himself as Professor James Wilson. Another was a younger woman named Dr. Sarah Kim. The third was an older man with a beard who said his name was Professor Robert Davis. "Sarah," Dr. Morrison said, "I have been teaching at the conservatory for 15 years, and I have never heard a high school student play with that level of creativity and musical maturity. Where did you learn to improvise like that?" Sarah looked at Mrs. Chun for help. She was not sure how to explain that most of what she had played tonight had come from her own experimentation at home. "I guess I just play around with melodies when I practice," Sarah said quietly. "I hear music in my head and try to figure out how to make my violin sound like what I am hearing." Professor Wilson nodded enthusiastically. "That is exactly what professional musicians do. You have natural musical instincts that usually take years of training to develop. Have you ever thought about studying music seriously?" Sarah's parents exchanged glances. They had always supported Sarah's violin lessons, but they had never considered that she might pursue music as a career. They knew that music school was expensive and that making a living as a musician was difficult. "We could not afford music college," Sarah's father said honestly. "I drive trucks and my wife is a nurse. We work hard, but we do not have money for expensive schools." Dr. Morrison smiled. "That is exactly why we have scholarship programs. Based on what we heard tonight, I think Sarah would be a strong candidate for a full scholarship. We would love to have her audition for our program." Sarah felt dizzy with surprise. A full scholarship? She had never imagined such a thing was possible. She looked at her parents and saw that they were equally shocked. "What would that mean exactly?" Mrs. Chun asked, speaking for the first time. Since the professors had approached, Professor Davis explained that the conservatory offered complete scholarships to exceptional students. This would cover tuition, private lessons with faculty members, and even help with living expenses if needed. Students in the program studied music theory, history, and performance technique while continuing their regular academic subjects. "We also have connections with youth orchestras, chamber music groups, and summer festivals," Dr. Kim added. "Students in our program get opportunities to perform with professional musicians and attend master classes with visiting artists." Sarah listened to all of this information with growing amazement. An hour ago, she had been a nervous high school student preparing to play a simple folk song. Now these professors were talking about changing her entire future, but other people wanted to talk to Sarah too. As the professors finished explaining the scholarship program, a group of local musicians approached. There was a man who played in a bluegrass band that performed at festivals around the region. A woman who taught private violin lessons introduced herself and said she would love to work with Sarah on advanced technique. Even a recording engineer who had been in the audience gave Sarah his business card and said he would like to help her make a demo recording. Word about Sarah's performance was already spreading beyond the community center. Several people were taking photos and posting them on social media. Someone had recorded part of the performance on their phone and was showing it to friends. By the next morning, Sarah would discover that videos of her playing were being shared online by people who had not even been at the show. Mrs. Chun was beaming with pride, but also looked a little overwhelmed. In 3 years of teaching Sarah, she had seen steady improvement and growing musicality, but she had not anticipated that her student was capable of the kind of artistry they had all witnessed tonight. "Sarah has always been special," Mrs. Chun told the professors. "She works harder than any student I have ever taught, and she has natural musical intelligence. But even I did not know she could do what she did tonight." Sarah's parents were having quiet conversations with the professors about practical details. How would the audition process work? When would she need to start? Could she continue living at home? They looked excited but also worried about making such a big decision over the next hour. As people slowly left the community center, Sarah found herself surrounded by encouragement and opportunities she had never dreamed of. Local newspaper reporters asked for interviews. Music teachers from other schools asked if Sarah would consider giving presentations to their students. Parents asked if she would be willing to give private lessons to their children. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when the little girl from the third row approached with her mother. The child looked up at Sarah with shining eyes and said, "That was the most beautiful music I ever heard. Can you teach me to play violin like that?" Sarah knelt down to the little girl's level. "What is your name?" she asked. "Emma," the girl replied. "Well, Emma, the most important thing is to listen to music with your heart, not just your ears. And never be afraid to try something new, even if it seems scary." Emma nodded seriously, as if she was memorizing Sarah's words. As Sarah's family finally drove home that night, she sat in the back seat holding her violin case and thinking about everything that had happened. In a single evening, her life had changed completely. She had discovered abilities she did not know she possessed and been offered opportunities she had never imagined. But more than that, Sarah had learned something important about courage and authenticity. The most powerful moment of her performance had come when she stopped trying to play it safe and started expressing her true musical voice. That lesson would stay with her for the rest of her life, not just in music, but in everything she chose to do. 3 months later, Sarah auditioned for the conservatory scholarship and was accepted immediately. Her journey from playing simple tunes to commanding concert stages had only just begun.